It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. And today I think we're going to try and change the conversation, because what you're really hearing about has been all about shelter. That's what the lawsuit's been about. And I want to reinforce, if you are in a shelter, you are still homeless. I want you to think about that. Because if we are planning on ending homelessness, we need to move beyond shelter. I was invited to introduce a couple of concepts today that will help us along the way. Many of you have been here before and have heard about some of the efforts that are going on in the county. And as Mark said, we're going to talk about some successful models of how we develop permanent supportive housing in the county. We're going to hear from our friends at Mercy House and how they developed in Santa Ana a community for individuals coming from homelessness with disabilities. We're going to hear a lot more from them about what that looks like. And then later on, I'm going to introduce a panel who will be speaking about a community that's been in existence for 10 years in Anaheim. How are we going to do this, though, going forward? How many of you live in Costa Mesa? Raise your hands if you live in Costa Mesa. Okay. How many of you live in Newport Beach? Okay, a lot of people. How many of you live further south, which is called the South County? Okay? So we have quite a varied amount of people represented here from different communities. But I think most of you probably understand that homelessness is the #1 issue in the county. If you didn't know that, you know it now. And some of the efforts that have been going on for the last decade are really beginning to come to fruition. How many of you have heard of the Orange County Housing Finance Trust? Okay. We had a panel about last year where one of the people very involved in making that a reality, it was actually a piece of legislation called AB 448, and it passed. So, and on January 1st, we now have the Orange County Housing Finance Trust. And I'm emphasizing the name because when we set out on this journey, we thought we were going to have the Orange County Housing Trust. Who knew? We already had that. We have another housing trust. And fortunately, the Orange County Business Council has recently reached an arrangement with the Orange County Housing Trust, which has been significantly dormant, I would say. But they have the name and they have a couple of $1 million. And so the Business Council is in a relationship with the Housing Trust to work on the same agenda of developing more affordable housing. They have already received a contribution of about $5 million from Disney, so that's a nice little pot. But the Orange County Housing Finance Trust is the new trust, and this is the legislation that passed last year. January 1 came into effect. And I don't know a lot about this. So I reached out to the group that actually know a lot about this and what's happening. And I've had a couple of calls. League of Women Voters called me the other day and said, what's happened? Are we doing anything with that? They knew that that housing trust had passed. And I'd reached out to Dave Kiff. Okay, who lives in Newport Beach and knows who Dave Kiff is? Quite a few of you. Dave Kiff was the city manager for the city of Newport Beach for 20 years. He was very involved in homeless issues, and after his retirement he moved to Dave Part 2 and he's taken on the lead as the interim director of the Association of California Cities. And in that role, Dave has been leading the conversations around the development of this housing trust, and it's all brand new. So I'm going to read from him what he said the purpose was, because I think it's really significant. The purpose of the Orange County Housing Finance Trust is to secure funding from state and local sources, both public and private, to provide it to willing jurisdictions for the purpose of ending homelessness. So those willing jurisdictions hopefully include the county, the 34 cities, but in order for them to implement that vision, they need to have joint powers authorities. So what's happening at the moment is that there are a group of committed city leaders and county leaders who are working on a process. They expect that by May or June, they will have that draft of a joint powers agreement in place. And we heard from Dave that as soon as later this month, he expects the Board of Supervisors to vote to be among the first leaders to lead this effort. Why is this significant, and why is the timing significant? Mainly because last November, many of us voted for Prop 1 and Prop 2. There's $6 billion in California available to develop permanent housing and affordable housing, some of it focused on veterans, but that's a lot of money. Orange County has historically not really participated in that. For whatever reason, we haven't been a player. We are a player. We are, I think, one of the first communities in the state to develop this housing trust. And what it will do, it will allow us, when the first monies from Prop 1, which is the money for housing for homeless and veterans, gets released, we will have a structure where a city and a community developer can go together to receive funding. And then it can be enhanced by what we hope the private sector will bring to the conversation. It's anticipated that in Orange County we might have as much of $100 million in matching money. So our vision here to develop 2,700 units of the kind of housing we know we need to end homelessness is going to really rely on the fact that we have a housing trust and we have cities and county government ready to apply to get that money. It's a great opportunity, and I think it will take us a long way into how we address homelessness. People often say to me, and I'm not speaking as a member of the Jamboree staff in this conversation, I'm really speaking because I've been involved in homeless issues for 19 years. And people say to me today, Helen, why do you think you can end homelessness now? I think it's because of all of you, because you're engaged in this, and it's going to take all of us. And we're seeing vehicles like the Housing Finance Trust come into being in Orange County. We're seeing the judge look at issues around homelessness and really help us to understand what it's going to take. And what we're talking about with the Housing Trust is not shelter. I just want to make that point again. If you're in a shelter, you're still homeless. So in order to house people, we must develop the housing solutions. And Mark encouraged me to allow you to ask some questions about the Housing Trust, the little that I know about it. But before I move from that, I just want to again mention the lawsuit that was filed against the South County cities. The 5 cities that were sued in the recent lawsuit are Irvine, Aliso Viejo, Dana Point, San Clemente, and San Juan Capistrano. And then the county, because they have the Sheriff's Department, who are really serving most of that community. I think sheriffs handle police and law enforcement services for about 22 cities in the county. And the main issue is around, and the litigation was filed by 3 agencies, non-profit agencies, and on behalf of 3 homeless individuals. And it's about lack of shelter and criminalization of homelessness. So those are the big issues. And if you Google it, you can find out a lot more issues and information about what that really means. But again, I want to remind you, it's about shelter, not housing. So we are developing a lot of shelters, and you might hear some more about some of the successes. You're going to hear from Hafsa in a minute about Santa Ana and what they're doing. But I want you to take your mind to what the end solution is to homelessness. It's a place where someone has a lock on the door, they have private space. That's what that looks like. It's not a shelter, it's housing. We'll take a few questions about what I just talked about before we get into the panel. And we have a mic here if somebody wants to run around with it if there are questions. Are you running for the mic, Marcia? What is it? Okay, I have a question over here.
Can you share with us a little bit about what happens after the Joint Powers Agreement finally gets formed? If that happens this summer, can you just take us through some steps from that to when there will actually be permanent supportive housing?
I could fudge, but I think at this point, because the documents are being drafted, we don't really know what that's going to look like. The only things that I have been told are that the county is very involved. In fact, the county CEO, Frank Kim, would have been here today to talk about this if he were able, but he's on his way with a group from the county to Washington, DC. So we know that it's probably going to start with the county, and we expect that it'll be, the structure is going to be 4 people from the county, 5 city electeds, and 3 people representing each of what are called the service planning areas, the North Service Planning Area, the Central, and the South. So that's the structure, and then once that's in place, and the funding will come online for some of this, I think other developers such as Jamboree and Mercy and other groups are already identifying sites where we can find a place where we can do a development. We're working on a development for veterans, and we already have the money, but if we were developing another community and this vehicle was in place, it probably would take us another year to get the funding together and then begin construction. So typically it takes 2 to 3 years to develop that solution.
Just a clarification, the lawsuit, even if successful, will not address the permanent housing issue, is that correct?
That's correct. And what we've seen with the settlements that have happened in the other cities where settlements have been made, it has created, we've seen a large number of new shelter beds, particularly in North and Central County, and Hafsa will talk about that in a minute, but it is about shelter, not about permanent housing. And I think the fear that those of us who've been working in this arena is that we will have people stuck in shelters. And I want you to look around this room and imagine that you're one of the women who are living in the Wise Place shelter in Santa Ana. There are 60 women on cots in a room about this size. What's the transition? If there's no housing, they're going to be still in that gymnasium on a cot. That's what a shelter is. Unfortunately, it's not housing with that key on the door. Yeah.
Helen, these 2,700 units of permanent supportive housing that are coming in, is there any percentages of individuals versus families in those 2,700 units?
Actually, the 2,700 units is really a number that is substantially made up of individuals, because that's where the greatest need is. We have a very vibrant family collaborative of agencies who are working on what's typically called rapid rehousing. Permanent supportive housing is focused, as you know, Mike, on people who are coming from chronic homelessness, meaning some significant amount of time, with a disability. So that's the largest population of unsheltered people in Orange County. And as our cost study showed us, thank you, Dr. Snow, the solution, we know, needs to be focused on those individuals, because they're not only the largest amount of our homeless, unsheltered population, but they're the most expensive. We can talk about that more at another time.